How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good, very
Good.
good.
How about you?
I'm pretty good.
Okay.
I'm writing three things at the same time. I'm writing a simple pledge letter that's not so simple, and I'm writing a minister's corner about the pledge, and then I'm writing a sermon about the pledge, and I'm playing the puzzle game, sorting different pieces into different piles. So I'm almost done. So that's the good news.
Well, let's get started.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As people join, I'll admit them from the waiting room. Really appreciate everyone's participation in this February Religion 101 seminar series.
I was just in a Zoom meeting.
Somebody needs to.
Yeah.
I'm James Light. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm a member of the South Coast Interfaith Council Board. And I want to welcome everyone. It's great to have you. Religion 101 is a great opportunity for all of us in the South Bay and the Long Beach community to learn about all the various religions, churches, faith communities that represent the richness of our spiritual and religious community. So we're happy to have everyone here, and we're happy to welcome Reverend Steve Wilson from the Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church in Palos, Verdes. He's going to speak to us tonight. And just as a reminder, the format of our seminar works like this. I'll turn the time over to Reverend Wilson, and he'll offer invocation in the form of prayer that his members of his church do express their prayer. Then we'll give him about an hour to talk about his religious community, faith, the origins, doctrines, principles, those kind of things, his personal experiences, all sorts of opportunities for him to share about his faith and what it means to him and to the members of his community. Usually about an hour in, we have a time where folks can start asking questions. We always have a lot of great questions and answers and discussion. And I always am very mindful to remind everyone to keep in mind that the purpose and intent is not so much to debate, maybe compare, because we learn a lot from comparing, especially our similarities in different religious and faith communities, and even oftentimes learn a lot from comparing the differences. But our intent is not to debate. It really is, as much as possible, for us to learn about from our speaker and from the faith community that he represents. So we're really grateful to have Reverend Wilson. I'm going to turn the time over to him, and we'll get started. So thanks very much.
Thanks, James. So let's find a place of stillness. Let's close your eyes, or just, center yourself. The act of exploring a new faith is itself an adventure, isn't it? It's to open yourself up and to understand that there are wisdoms outside your grasp. And this very Religion 101 series is exactly that. That speaks well to Unitarian Universalism, and I think you'll see that that level of opening is our specialty, and I invite you to join us with open hearts and know that the Unitarian Universalists have a skeptical tradition, but we come with open, loving hearts to all religious traditions, which is why I'm right here in front of our essentially kind of a world religions flag. You can see all the different faiths, or a lot of the world religions, faith traditions, circled around our center chalice, which is our symbol. So let that be our light for today. Kelly's going to show us some slides. I'm going to just sort of march us through a PowerPoint that I built, And so we're gonna see this first. This is just Unitarian Universalism 101 based on the class. So I thought I'd first talk about sort of culturally. I think the most interesting thing about us, or the quickest way to get us, is sort of culturally who we are, right? So here's a few ideas and a few phrases that are worth digesting that I'm going to kind of walk us through. And you're welcome to close your eyes. There's nothing spectacular about the images you're going to get. Just listen for a minute. Here you go. Unitarian Universalists are generally highly ethical people who've either evolved or backslid, depending on your perspective. I think that's kind of the truth, into a personal place where the particular assertions, the things that they would say they believe in, particularly as it relates to a supernatural faith, have generally moved to become less a priority than embracing an always shifting expression of what is called for by their core ethics and values, right? So we are, as it says below before, we're deeds. We're generally interested in what you do. There's a great statement. Emerson, the transcendentalist author, was a Unitarian, probably the most famous one, and he said something a long time ago. He said, the gospel you're living is shouting so loudly I can't hear what you're saying, which I think we can all testify to as being an anti-hypocritical kind of statement. We're also interested in principles, not rules. So that immediately, to many people who are very conservative, appropriately places us in this sort of, we're often accused of being sort of flexitarians, right? Where we practice situational ethics. And so things are always up for debate for Unitarian Universalists. The great joke is if you've got, 3 Unitarian Universalists in the room, you've got 4 opinions, right? And that openness is in part, and the creeds in part, has built by a faith that developed to come to the realization that fate is not predetermined, right? It's very much a rejection or a move away from the idea that like people's characters were written into the book of life, and that there's this sort of a historical timeline that humans are marching down. Unitarians came to adopt that scientific principle that what's out in the future is yet to be determined and, sort of within our control. So we were part of the early adopters of what would have become, in Christian terms, the social gospel movement, where the development and the cultivation of the kingdom on earth was sort of became a powerful metaphor for Christianity, liberal Christianity in particular, for the end of the 1800s into about, we'll call it the World Wars, that period of time. There was like an optimistic sense that humans could sort of control their fate and develop their character, right? There's a lot of talk about developing our character. Let's hit the next slide. Here's some more quotes. Unitarian Universalism is a place where people who have rejected more traditional faith, that's sort of mostly who we get. We do find people at the fringes, and we do have people who are, are Judeo-Christians. We don't have too many traditional Judeo-Christian people, but we have a lot of people, including myself, who absorb and hold a lot of their Christian identity. These people find a community to explore their religion in, a lot of exploring, a lot of seeking. We are very attractive to people who are on the search for truth. A lot of people obviously land with us, many of them here and from my congregation. And we create an environment that is very safe for doubt and innovation. So when we have a conversation, we have a group called Seekers, and in that group, we have conversations with people who believe in angels. We have, a lot of sort of humanist atheists in the room. There's a fairly active debate about what's true, and that openness has compelled UUs to be concerned about sort of good behavior and making sure that we don't have a lot of hate speech at the UU Church, because we want to create a safe space for people who are not fixed in their faith. Most UUs, in addition to supporting most of the Judeo-Christian values, that's sort of not generally where the rift comes. It's, more in people feeling like there's been hypocrisy, or that the things that are said by traditional religions, particularly in the West, are too fixed and aren't historically accurate. Most UUs have broadened those values into a commitment that adds reason and science. So we're really very much Americans, and we're very much part of that Enlightenment tradition. As time has moved on, we've sort of embraced a postmodernist ethos where paganism and different voices, people of color and feminist voices, have come in to sort of share the stage and have their own place. And that's meant that theology for us, interestingly enough, is often it's almost a verboten subject. We're much more politically aligned than we are theologically aligned, except that we tend to be theologically aligned in skepticism. So all of that has led us to almost demand and need that we have tolerance at the very forefront of what we do. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of all people, which some people, even within our own congregation, reject because they think it's too fixed a thing to say. That's how deconstructionist and critical UUs can be, is we don't even agree on our own principles half the time, and we love that. So just more gobbledygook about UU. I'm going to invite questions a little bit sooner, I think, but we're going to keep moving. Unitarian Universalism has evolved into a non-creedal religion, which I said before, and being formally non-creedal means that there are no binding or definitive things that one has to agree on to be a UU. You just have to play well in the sandbox and you're accepted. What would-be creeds have turned into these broadly agreed upon principles, which just feel softer to us and are more malleable across time. So we have 7 principles, and they read very much, I'm going to get to them in a minute, but you'll notice that they read very much, I always say, like Eleanor Roosevelt wrote them when she was drafting the Declaration of Human Rights. They're very kind of secular modern. And then we have we have 6 sources. So 7 principles, 6 sources, and in the sources, you'll see those 2. We have a sense of where we allow wisdom to come in. And those are what we sort of find as authoritative as any UU allows anything to be authoritative. Yeah. This means that we tend to have a very practical theology. UUs, you can call us UUs, you can call us Unitarian Universalists. Those are 2 separate traditions that came together in 1961. They roughly share the same time frame. They're not different from James Light's Mormonism. We are one of these American traditions. We inherit more from the European intellectual tradition than Mormons do, but we come around at around the same time. We have our greatest popularity in the 1830s through about the Civil War. And at one point, Abraham Lincoln said that he'd be surprised that by the end of his century, everyone wasn't a Universalist, right? So we had this the Universalists had this great trend. They had, Universalism had mostly rejected the notion of sinners in the hands of an angry God. They had rejected the idea that God was more about judgment than about love. And that became a very popular idea. Back to our text. Ours is a practical theology. If we take this faith seriously, it must have a real and discernible impact on how we live. So, again, there's a great Universalist story. Hosea Ballou is riding along with a circuit rider from a more traditional faith. And the circuit rider is sort of trying to come to terms with what Universalism is and says to him, and they're friends, and he says, Hosea, so let me get this straight. If I were to knock you over the head with this stick and steal your horse, I would still get to heaven. And Hosea Ballou responds, yes, that's true. However, if you were a Universalist, that thought would generally not cross your mind. So there's a sense of an optimism in human nature that we try to cultivate. this makes us very weak on the notion of evil or sin. So we have an almost mute, I would call it, I mean, it's appropriate because it's hard to know what to do with it, but we're almost stupid about evil. We really don't have a strong theological sense about the worst of our human nature. We are the faith, and I don't love this image, but we're the faith that sort of wants to empower people and see the good in people more than judge them. Let's one more. Sorry. All right. So here's a couple symbols and language that might help us grasp that. The chalice is the symbol we've embraced. And you see the flame, and that's sort of the warmth of community is what we say. We adopted the symbol, I think, before we realized what we were doing. But we call that the warmth of the community. We call the chalice part of a candle, essentially the holding agent of community. And it's symbolic in the sense that a chalice also looks like a cross. So we have that Christian part. In terms of thinking about where we fall theologically, we'll get to that a little bit, but it's important to say that Judeo-Christian roots are where we come from. We were Protestants. We were Protestants that sort of jumped to life at the time of the Reformation and then disagreed with the Trinity and disagreed with like Luther and Calvin coming in and sort of reestablishing tight norms around the church, which obviously helped the church be strong. We are by nature kind of anarchists. We tend to not like rules very well. So we were also heretics. At every sort of big church decision, we lose that debate. So all along Christianity, there's this sense in which we're like, wait a minute, and that we wanted to play along, but we were sort of not invited, and we were kept outside the fold of what orthodoxy was. And the chalice is also brought up. It's a relatively new faith with them formed together. And there was also a symbol of there was a hospital in Europe that had essentially a chalice with snakes, the Hippocratic oath sort of blended together on a metal fence. I've seen it. It's in either Poland or Prague. I can't remember. I should know that. And that place was a safe house for people trying to escape Nazi Germany. So UUs were very instrumental in a couple of different adventures to get people out of Europe. And that's a little the source of the symbol as well. Here's our 7 principles. There's the inherent worth and dignity of each person, right? So we're trying to lift up and honor everyone. That becomes very important when it comes to issues of race, in particular, even more so when it becomes issues of people with disabilities or people who were various levels of places on the gender and sexual choice sort of spectrum. So we wanted to lift people up and affirm them first. And then we say a bunch of nice things like justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, good sort of neutral language, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth within our congregations, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So you're free to search truth and meaning out, but you are called to do so in a responsible manner, right? That would sort of speak to people kind of in the modern movement of like every internet craze and every speculative conspiracy theory. They could be called out because their search is not responsible. Behind that is sort of just a sense that reason prevails, of course. We talk about the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. So for us, in a different way than the Catholic Church sort of honors its hierarchy appropriately and has been like sustained by that for 2,000 years, we as Americans sort of, we're very Lockean, Jeffersonian. That those people might be familiar with the concept of deism. Those deists are sort of right there theologically at the time of our start. So that theism, but with a reluctance and a compromised sense of what God is. Emerson and the Transcendentalists chose to call God the Oversoul. So there was already at our very beginnings in the American context, particularly for the Unitarians, an effort to think about God not so much as the Father, but as the creator of the universe, or these overarching kind of principles that people had various opinions on. Moving down the list, we have the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. So there is a very strong, these were built, you remember, in 1961 and sort of talked about through the 80s. So you have a very strong kind of Esperanto kind of world governance. UUs are very connected to, we have a big movement around connected to the United Nations. We are very generally globalists. You know, at any point in time when people try to be exclusive, UUs are trying to widen that circle, right? The circle of care must embrace a broader group of people, must always sort of embrace the Christian concept of who the neighbor is as broad with UUs as it is anywhere else. So we have, and then we added the eighth principle, which is the UU favorite one for most people. It's the respect for the interdependent web of all creation or all existence of which we are a part. So Unitarian Universalists, late to the game theologically, have the sort of modern advantage of, the seventh, sorry, of the capacity to, that we are part of nature and not above it, right? We're not sort of, we tend to sort of reject the sort of lower than the angels, the kind of tripartite sort of world that came to being in the time when, you know, scripture was written. So those are our principles. Our sources are that kind of just generic sense of religious wonder, right? A sunset, a rainbow, falling in love, a mystical experience. We honor that. We probably would be very critical of following someone who said that I believe that, you know, I'm the recreation of Jesus or whatever. We have a respect. This is sort of the simplistic version of the language. The language is a little more flowery, really, but I thought this was a good, colorful slide to show. We respect women and men from long ago and today whose lives inspire us. So you're going to get as much grace and wonder for Gandhi and, you know, quite a bit from Mother Teresa, and you're going to get some for a lot from Martin Luther King, and you're going to get some for Jesus. But Jesus is sort of one of them, right? He sort of moved his way from, he's sort of my personal hero, and for many people, he would be on their heroic list, but it's not the same as if it's a Messiah. There are Unitarians around the world who come out of the British tradition, and the British tradition remained much more Christian. So we were more like them at the start of the American version of Unitarianism, which is the sort of stronger and more dominant of the two of our strains. Universalism was, as time evolved, became a bit of a second fiddle and was much more Christian than Unitarians were. Unitarians kind of pulled in Universalists and in an argumentative way could say that they swallowed them as well. We also honor the ethical and spiritual wisdom of the world's traditions. So, you know, I'm going to do at least a sermon a year on something. Like at the end of March, I'm preaching on Zoroastrianism, just to live up a different tradition. Preached fairly recently on Taoism and Lao Tzu. So we're always trying to learn, right? Honor. A lot of Buddhist UUs. A lot of people meditate, a lot of yoga. And then right down there, Christian and Jewish teachings. So you can feel that, right? There's the world religions, and then there's the Christian Judeo tradition, which are separated from the rest of them, because it's obviously a world tradition as well. We honor that specifically because those are our roots. And as you know, the simplest way to say it, if you came to a UU church, it would look like a Protestant service. We look like a duck, but we don't quack that much like a duck. And I'm going to get to sort of what a service looks like in a little bit. Again, we've given acknowledgement to the use of science and reason. So that's right there with world religions and awe and mystery. We honor that religious tradition and the harmony of nature and the sacred circle of life. All of this means that we are, the great thing about Unitarian Universalism is it doesn't have to stumble over its tradition to adopt a new truth. We're very fluid with that. The weak spot about Unitarian Universalism is it that it doesn't have the kind of classic great traditions that Islam and Judaism and Christianity have that like make you feel like you're part of something thousands of years old. We've got that, but it's scant history. And, you know, when you walk into a Catholic church, you just, you know, I mean, I feel it. You feel like you are walking into, you know, epic time, right? And you think about the Jews going back 3,000, you know, any number of years, all those traditions that have adapted, and Hanukkah and Passover, like that's old stuff. So we're a little jealous of that, but we like the fact to think that we're nimble on our feet and the fact that we can adapt. And we, you know, so we have the largest, you know, we have more women clergy than men. We are on the front lines of people of, you know, who are non-binary and transgendered, and they're in the clergy as well. So we have a very sort of forward-thinking philosophy. The interesting thing about that is that demographically, as liberal as we are and philosophically, we are culturally pretty predictable and dull. The average UU is probably somewhere around 60, is white, is generally fairly well educated, is probably economically pretty comfortable, and could have come to their tolerance because they sort of kind of rejected everything else. So there we are. And that last one, if I haven't mentioned, is the harmony of nature and the sacred circle of life. That's our seventh principle. That's the kind of pagan soul of us. That's the walk in the woods. That's the throw the books in the pond. That's the, you know, take acid and, you know, go stare at the clouds. I mean, that's that. We have that side of our tradition as well. We have a little bit of hippie in there too. So we're these reasonable hippie egghead types. There was a debate about what the most UU thing to do was fairly recently, last 2 or 3 years, that went through the world, which is our publication. And Spirit of Life was, I think it was second to lighting the chalice, which was the first, but this was right there. So in the 80s, a woman named Carolyn McDade wrote a piece at a women's spirituality conference and wanted to try to make it as inclusive as possible. And that meant leaving God out of it, certainly Jesus. And this was the song that we would probably call has evolved into a UU anthem. It's called Spirit of Life. Come unto me, right? These vague spiritual terms we've all sort of experienced, but are hard to define. We honor that. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, nature imagery. Rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. So taking the images of justice, moving them into the real life. We spend a lot of time right now talking about the beloved community and an anti-racist ecological future where everyone is welcome. Roots hold me close. We honor that, you know, everybody needs to be nurtured and feel a part of something. We spend a lot of time with our kids on that. Wings set me free, right? You know, if you love something, set it free. Spirit of life, come to me, come unto me. And that's a sort of a short, relatively soft song, kind of tends to accompany a prayer time for us in the middle of the service for many, many UU tradition UUs. And it kind of just, it gives us kind of a centering. I thought I'd be playful and just kind of come up with what a traditional UU service would look like. And so I played with this a little bit. Take the skeleton, the basic frame of a Protestant church. Many of the Eastern churches were and are more Christian than they are out West. Take the classic style and dress of a a choir, a minister, and I'm not a modern, like, mega church. I'm talking about sort of like a Methodist church, right? Probably a smaller community than sits in a high school auditorium. The church is beautiful. Maybe it's simplistic. It has some variety to it. That's about 50% of what you'd experience just visually. You'd experience a very Protestant. Add to that sort of the content that would come, 25% of it being from like a liberal arts course, right? You're going to get like psychology and world religions. You're going to get a little bit of a lecture, probably. Then a 16th% of the service is like some old hymn with archaic words, often poetic and beautiful. Usually we have taken Christian hymns and we've sort of gone through with our little red pens and we've decided what we didn't like about the words, and that was to this and this is to that. So we've rewritten the words in some hymns and we've created a whole bunch of new music as well. I'd call that next 16th the portion of new music, and we're trying to be more upbeat. We're trying to be a little bit hipper, and we're trying to, despite our demographics, be more multicultural. I mean, that has really been the focus for some time now, and since George Floyd's death and all of the racial awakening that's happened, full bore ahead on that. And we spend a lot of time at PUC talking about how to be more inclusive, and a little bit of self-loathing about how white we are, but like really with the commitment to be a part of creating the world that needs to be, that's peaceful in the future, ecological, and multiracial, or at least harmonious. Then you got some poetry, probably from some poet that killed themselves or something, something that's like, rich and dark and, sometimes flowery and open. Kelly, by the way, is a good friend of mine, and, just a big helper at church. She does a lot of technology for us, and, just is a good cheer and very, very helpful. So to add to the service, you want to have a heartfelt desire to make a difference. The service should sort of compel you to do more. You should have some sort of sad acknowledgement that the world is not as we wish it was, and that life is harder than it should be. This is sort of where we kind of all wish we were more faithful, right? UUs tend to have that kind of sense about themselves. I would add a little bit of a splash of that sense of noblesse oblige, that you should get out and be more charitable and perform more social justice, and probably be a better person. Then add an equal dose of both a kind of sense of privilege guilt, which is sort of built into that, that we personally and that the church isn't doing enough. We live up on this beautiful hill in Palos Verdes, and we don't quite utilize our space like we wish we would. We're not as big as we want to be. We're not as impactful as we want to be. And then also you should have a little bit of a prideful side that, we're pretty good and I do my part. So somewhere in there is the ethics of what a UU generally feels. A lot of community and just joy to be together too. And we've got, at our church, we got great food and we've got really good fellowship too. So, so you have to have that dose of regret that we're more diverse, and yet also this sort of frustration that the world should be beating down our door, and yet we're too small for given how like smart and cool we are. So you should feel that way too. And then you add to that a pretty well-crafted, hopefully, and thoughtful sermon, and a handful of connections. That's pretty much close to what a UU service should be like. We have a trigger light here. There we go. The lights didn't go out in Georgia. So Universalists formed in the late 1800s. The Unitarians were around earlier than this, but formed officially in the early 19th century, kind of around Boston. Both of them were New England experiences. Universalists were more rural, and they developed as a response to the Great Awakening, the tent revival movements that were popular at that time. Universalists came around to focus on God's love, human character. The classic Universalist moment is to watch the religious circus, as they would often call it, come into town have people do an altar call, and then in a week go back to being the same schmucks they were before, and wondering that that religion isn't going to work because character isn't cultivated quite enough. Unitarians share the same sort of arc of history, and just at every turn became more and more accepting and more liberal, right? We went from being sort of Christians to transcendentalists before we knew what happened. And then we went to embrace kind of world religions some, and then came to embrace ethical humanism at the start of the 20th century. And then as the century moved on, we tended to embrace the feminism and the ecological paganism, and sort of come to just embrace all the voices that were on the religious horizon at the time. Like I said before, we were Christian heretics that mostly lost to the Orthodox forces. We were formed at a time in which biblical criticism had kind of gotten started, particularly in Germany. Like I said before, we have that kind of deist. We were theists, many of us still are, but you want to sort of tinker with scripture. You don't want to accept it quite full bore. Prior to the Enlightenment, Unitarians during the Reformation rejected the concept of the Trinity as a means of understanding the relationship between God and Jesus. For Unitarians, Jesus is superhero, role model, mentor, not quite savior most of the time. So we were accused of being Sabbatarians, which were a little group also connected to being Jewish. So Unitarians were often sort of accused in broad brushes of being Jewish because they didn't put Jesus in the Trinity theologically. And again, both of them sort of came around at the time in which we were sort of working with the blind and, starting to develop cures for diseases and beginning to build schools that were public in the United States. So all of those things led many people in the United States to sort of go, it's not fair to say we're exactly sinners, because we also do good things. We do as many good things and we have the potential to do more. So the idea that we're sinners in the hands of an angry God doesn't really fit. And now we've come a long way to, like, it's very difficult to even talk about sin. I love the concept of sin. I think it's a great word and I just like it. But, every time I bring it up, I get sort of scolded. So that's a little bit of who we are as well. Merged in 61 after about 50 years of collaborating. The Universalists were afraid they'd be swallowed and their Christianity essentially would be sort of swallowed. They were about right on that. And let's see, in the early 1800s, a lot of the leaders around New England, Adams had the largest collection of Hindu books and books from the East of anyone in America. And there is an interesting relationship sort of in early Unitarianism, particularly with Hinduism. And again, we embraced that ethical humanism that eventually allowed atheists to become clergy, right? And like I marched us through before, as you can see on the slide, the 60s embraced more and more open theology. Let's see. We have the history of the Transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau. The more interesting part that people may not know is that we really are the heritage, us and the Congregational Church, the UCC as we mostly know it, we have the legacy of the Puritan and churches that are around Boston. So when Boston began to grow, and in each town, there came enough people that they needed more than one church. The theological trends of being more liberal and more conservative were pulling at each other. At the same time, the populations of many of those towns were pulling at each other to demand another building. So Congregationalists and Unitarians basically split the first churches in America and kind of went their separate ways. UCC are really our closest connection in terms of of a denomination. There was talk even 5 or 10 years ago of trying to merge them back, because the great joke about congregational churches is, what does UCC stand for? It's Unitarians Considering Christ, right? UCC churches tend to be so liberal that there's an openness to, most ideas. So that's the joke. Let's see. I think I covered this with universalism. Here's some trends. We are about static in terms of numbers. We are gaining recent retirees who are white. We are losing children, as many churches are. We're slightly gaining in the Hispanic demographic, but that's mostly because we're growing in the Southwest a little bit. We're losing African Americans, interestingly enough, at a time in which we spend more time talking about African Americans than we've ever had. And we're gaining in that, like I said, that sort of demographic of white people. Like I said, more than 50% of the clergy are female. For combinations of reasons, we are sort of in the movement, like many people are, of engaging and looking at white supremacy culture and how we play a role in it. There's about 160,000 of us nationwide. That's a very small movement. That's probably the size of Torrance and the peninsula, I'm guessing, maybe not even that. There are about 500,000 to 600,000 Americans who would determine that they're Unitarian Universalists, but they would not. Only about a third of those are actively enrolled in any one of our 1,000 to 1,050 churches spread across the United States. Most of those being in sort of urban areas, but not exclusively. The great frustration of our tradition is why so many people share our open, religious, spiritual search values, but aren't UUs. So a lot of possible UUs spend their Sunday mornings reading the New York Times, right? There, listening to NPR. Kind of, we always sort of get greedy and jealous for all those people who think like us, but aren't in our communities. And you can take a quick peek of sort of the percentages of people and where they're, like, the darker colors are sort of where there are larger numbers of UUs. Obviously the Northeast, where we have our roots, California, San Francisco, kind of Pacific Northwest, and then some urban centers, you'll tend to find that a little bit. A few little unique spots. Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, is where our largest church is, kind of an anomaly. Minneapolis has a very big church. Rochester, New York has a very big church. Sort of odd. Boston has a ton of churches. There's a church in just about every town. Some churches, the town I'm from has 2 churches with 200 to 300 members in it. But there's also a lot of really small churches in the rural towns around Massachusetts that make up our numbers, but don't fill them with very many people. So when I first started in the ministry, I served 3 churches at the same time in Vermont and Western Mass. And I would preach to like 15 to 20 people and then drive 5 miles and preach to another 15 to 20 people an hour later. And then, so there's a lot of those small congregations in these classic New England churches, some of them on the green, right? Some of those classic churches that are very, you just sort of go, oh, it's a Protestant church. They're often UU churches, particularly back east. So around the world, we have different groups, and there are sort of small populations. Many of them come from the British expansion around the globe, right? So we have a large group of Unitarians in the Khasi Hills of India. Interestingly enough, there's about 5,000 people who were, we like to joke that they were 150 years ago, they were headhunters. So they adopted Unitarianism just as in the way that they might have adopted becoming Methodists or Presbyterians or something else, Church of England. And there's interestingly a group in Transylvania, which, of course, is like, given that we're often slurred for being, satanic or not believing in God, Transylvania is a really odd, quixotic place for us to have 160,000 Unitarians, and they're very Christian. They don't even, like, they're very old school. Men and women tend to not even sit in the same part of the church. I've been there, and we have a pilgrimage headed there as soon as the pandemic breaks. And their partner churches all over the Transylvania hills in Romania now, was in Hungary before the war. There's an International Council of UUs. There's a United Nations office. There's a partner church council, which is primarily around Transylvania. And there's the service committee that does projects around the world, water in Guatemala. We've got a few little pockets of places. There's a Holding India project, which was American Unitarians went to India and began to serve some of the untouchables as a project I have some interest in, and might, take a leave of absence and go there and do some, things there. We have great tensions between where the head or our intellectual side meets our heart. There's sort of a war within UUs as to whether we're more emotive and open or we're more critically thinking. You can feel that in our loyalties. We have a lot of, like I said, tension around why we're not more, why we are who we are and what we want to be is more diverse. We tend to have quite a bit of shared political ethos around. Most of UUs are Democrats or left-leaning people. We've lost some Republicans. We've probably lost half of our Republicans in the last 20 years, and that, I think, is pretty much attributable to the fact that when you come to UU Church, it's very hard to sort of hold that, the libertarian side of us competes against our sort of progressive, intentionally green side. So there's a tension around that within our fold. There's a tension between how much we honor our Judeo-Christian roots and how much we're forward-thinking. There's a tension within our congregations as to how free we are and how connected we are to a broader movement. So we're not really a denomination. We choose not to call ourselves that. We are freely associated congregations. And if you just think of that libertarian spirit in us, you should laugh at us, because we can't even be singular within ourselves. We're such irreverent vagabonds by spirit. So the way we're singular helps us market ourselves, and the way that we're free helps us be adaptive. So they sort of compete against one another. Let's see. In parting, let's see. We understand, the greatest thing about us is that we understand the future will be many truths and many voices. So we're sort of ahead of the curve on that. And we believe seeking to give voice to the best expressions of humanity lifts us all. We're very open to anyone who wishes to become anything they really want to be, as long as they do so compassionately. Being together, a community of people who know that science is real, and that who people love is simply just who they love, whether it's a biological determinant or it's a choice. That compassion is its own wisdom. That freedom to be who you really are is probably the greatest path to personal happiness and global peace that exist. We're very against putting people into boxes. And that often when we gather to share those values, there's a kind of a magical openness that takes place. We, particularly here at Pacific Unitarian Church, which is something that I think is just great, we close our services with these statements, and I'll close this to open up for questions. Amen, shalom, salam, namaste, and blessed be. Thank you. So we'll take questions, and you can, I don't know how we're going to do that exactly, but we'll figure it out. I think you can unmute yourself if you want, right, James? Is that true?
Yes. So thanks very much for that great presentation and
Thanks.
And explanation. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Not all at once.
Well, I always have lots of questions, so I'll ask the first one.
Yeah.
One of the things that I ask folks to talk about is how they empower and support youth young people to make good decisions, good choices. And your emphasis on ethics
Yep.
and the principles that you talked about clearly demonstrate that that's an important focus. At least that's what I got. And so so I guess the way I'd ask the question is to expand on a little bit is, how do you work with youth to make those kinds of choices, to make good choices, to speak out, in the situations that they may be in, especially in school? I mean, we all know, right? School is where people can be the cruelest or people can shine the most as far as demonstrating and representing and being a good example in how they relate to others. With all of those aspects you talked about, supporting the worth of others, no matter what their situation is, what they're, supporting diversity and tolerance, and showing love to others, regardless of how they're similar or different. And those can always be challenges for youth, because that part of the brain is always pushing them to sort of congregate in sort of similar like groups and cliques and these kind of things. So is there anything that you, even if it's just your personal experience or your emphasis, Steve, what you try to do to help and encourage young people in your community to make good choices?
Well, I think we do, more than, I think what you just said is a lot of where our focus is, right? We have a very practical theological perspective. And so we spend a lot of time on cultivating that individual conscience. There's a leading woman, the most famous educator of children is a woman named Sophia Lyon-Faz. And the quote that sort of rings true for all of us is, we're much more interested in igniting the sort of spirit within someone than filling their heads with the answers. So we'd spend a lot of time talking about those kind of debates. Probably the most famous curriculum that we have working today is Our Whole Lives. So that's a sexuality training for teens, and there's a whole program that's built down to younger and younger kids and built up. So we really do try to empower people to make their own ethical choices. And I think that, we have we have an optimism that if people don't have traumatizing experiences and they are asked to apply with, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, we really have a faith that those people are going to come up with good answers. So that personal conscience is cultivated. I mean, it's obviously cultivated in all religious traditions, but we would cultivate it without any of the sort of what can be helpful or trapping apparatus that surrounds it, right? It's more free and a little bit, sadly, more vacant from the sort of history of heroes. And I think that we struggle with a lot of kids walk away from the UU world and they really don't know who they are. So I think that's one of the struggles we face, is because Unitarian Universalism is so open, it's hard to sort of learn a catechism, right? Other than you're kind of on your own to make moral choices. And that's where we fall down. So we've got a lot of curriculum, really smart curriculum, but in the end, you're asking young people to think for themselves often very early. So it's wonderful in that way. And I think, I'm grateful. I grew up as an Episcopalian, and I sort of feel blessed that I had those roots. And, I came to Unitarian Universalism in my 20s. I mean, I was in divinity school before I ever walked into a UU church. So I'm a bit of an anomaly. We get a lot of kids who, whose parents are into the free thinking. So we've got a lot of multicolored hair kids and people on the spectrum. And we've got a lot of folks who are, what do you call it? Not heteronormative and sort of, so there's a strong sense of that. And we really do encourage people to not bully, and we have a whole, we went through a whole curriculum our kids did about, nonviolent communication. So yeah, we do what you just said we do a lot. And the kids almost always, the most classic curriculum we have is neighboring faiths. And almost always it's the easiest thing for us to run is we'll just take kids to a bunch of different churches and synagogues and mosques and stuff and talk about the differences with us. So there's a lot of that going on. And then of course there's UU history and stuff, but our history is, we don't have 2,500 years of saints. I mean, I know the saints, but the kids generally don't. Anything else?
Thanks. I was just going to say that a lot of religious traditions, there are things that sort of make them unique, right? And and to build that sense of community. And the double-edged sword side of that is by building that community, it can sort of narrowly focus people on just those that are in the community, right? And so I do find it really fascinating and admirable that you have this emphasis on looking out and at least and I shouldn't say, but clearly elucidating that your goal is to be tolerant and to learn outside of just the people that you're around. And it is sort of ironic that doesn't catch on. I think that could be very appealing because it's just my experience and my experience with my son who's 19 now, who's been through school, and just the way his group and the way he interacted with others at school in that sort of community, which is very diverse, was guided a lot by his principles. And it wasn't just that we taught him in the home and from our religion about being kind to others and sort of opening him to sort of being nice to others and looking for opportunities to sort of say hi or be friendly to the person that's different or that's outside of the group. So, and it's one thing to teach it and preach it. It's another thing for them to put it into practice and have even the courage to do it. So it's clear to me that there's a lot that you have to offer with that emphasis and focus that is the right paramount in your principles, stated principles to work with youth, to cultivate those and develop those kinds of attributes. The nonviolent communication, I mean, it's something that we don't think about. We think our kids are just going to go talk to people and they can communicate, but heck, sometimes we have trouble communicating in our own family, effectively, right? We stumble all over it. So that I appreciate that example because it sounds, as you said, very pragmatic, give some real practical skills that they can and tools that they can apply to communicate with others. So thanks very much for sharing that. I wanted to, there's folks who have posted some stuff in the chat, which is really great. So one question was, I guess a couple questions are about how you have been meeting during COVID and sort of what, I will sort of expand upon that to say that in addition to sort of the methods you're using, what are the challenges that you have faced or that you see yourself facing as someone, as a leader, a spiritual leader to your congregation, with all of the obstacles and things that are just a consequence of, our locality dealing with COVID?
Well, I think my congregation's been as strong at that as I am. I mean, I tend to be a visitor, so I tend to have good relationships with people, but I don't feel like I've responded as quickly and as deftly to building the connections for other people. So we've built pods. So we did this little, zip code thing where we put people together who were geographically together at the start of the pandemic to see if they could, get groceries for one another and just sort of have a support system. We already had, 2 to 3 chalice groups that existed. We added and bumped up our adult education programming. So I have sort of focused on trying to give people as many moments like this one to connect with one another. So we continue to have some of the traditions like our black and white concert. I have invented a couple Zoom calls that, people can just come on. So we did Zoom calls with the kids at different levels. So I don't know if we've done any better or worse than any other group has during this period of time. We've got people watching the services from geographically distant places that otherwise would never have seen it before. We invested in a relatively high-end camera system that now sort of forces us to be inside when we possibly could go outside, but because we now have so people watching the service, so we're we're fumbling along like anybody else with no greater wisdom than any other church, has about how to manage that, and are very excited about getting back together again. Got phone trees calling people. We're having an anniversary dinner where we decided to commission a restaurant to provide a single meal, which was our tradition, and then have it delivered to people's houses. And then I'm going to interview someone, an African-American park ranger of some renown. So we're going to have some entertainment. We're trying to sort of fill in the gaps. We're in the middle of starting the pledge drive. So we're sort of every part of the year, right? You're encountering a new thing you haven't done in a pandemic before. And, I think I give ourselves, in terms of response, I give ourselves a B-, C+ in terms of how we're marching along. There's definitely some people who've, are technologically challenged that we haven't really reached that concern me. I've just gone out and made 15 to 20 visits to seniors with one of our young teens and her mother to just sort of give gift baskets to people just to feel like they've got a touch, who aren't on these calls. We kind of went through a list. And sort of saw the most vulnerable people and trying to get out to them. We've got about 2/3 of the way through the list in terms of visits, knocking on the door. Some people let you in, it's masked, it's the whole thing. So, fumbling along like everybody else, biology rules, and we're following in the wake.
I would suggest it's well said, fumbling along like everyone else, because I think all of us have been doing the best we can, and there are stumbles and there are adjustments, and then there are things that come up and you're like, wow, that's really actually pretty cool. And maybe that wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, right? So like you mentioned, people watching the service or participating from far away and stuff. So
we're going to start a drumming circle that Kelly's starting, that's going to involve people from my other church, right? So the writing group is virtual. There's, it's a mixed bag. I'm writing a piece for the newsletter. I've created a world called Problemotunities, and it's sort of where the problem has created an opportunity that kind of allows you to slip the tracks and do something different than you did before, that you want to hold on to when we go back to the normal of when things are more physical. So Problemotunities are headed our way.
great, thanks. Any other questions?
I'm getting one that says, do you work under a global or national leadership? So we do. There really isn't global leadership. America is the leader of Unitarian Universalists around the world, although Britain has quite a few too. It sort of comes from Britain more than anywhere else, kind of like America does, probably in the same proportion of origin of, sort of who got early control. There's no global church. It would be the US, it would be the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, but that's a fairly weak association. Each church picks its own ministers. It could thrive or fall on its own account. It pays dues to the national organization. We have regional bodies and we have a national body, and the dues basically roughly accumulate to being about $100, with about 2/3 going to the national and 1/3 going to the regional offices. But here's how classically independent UUs are. those dues are sort of voluntary, and right, you're not kicked out of the fold for paying 80% of your dues. I mean, there's some perks to being a full-fledged donor as a church, but there's not a whole lot of leverage from overhead, right? I mean, part of the structures of synods and dioceses and parishes is that the church itself controls the church. So there's an efficiency to that. Like, there never would be, if the UUs had control over it, there wouldn't be a church that had 15 members on a Sunday that had a service with another church 15 minutes away. I mean, that's sort of silly. But given that both those churches are the first parishes in their town and are these historic buildings, I mean, I served a church that had parts of the building from 1735. So it's a small rural town. You close that church and the church just loses the institution that manages its most historic building. So what advantage is there, right? Like, there's often not a lot of assets to close to gain. So that's part of the challenge for UUs as well, is that there are sort of more churches than there should be in a weird way, right? And, what we really need are more parishioners. We don't need more ministers like me. That's for sure. We need more members like those folks on the call.
Carol asked a second question. Did you see that one, Steve?
I remember positive experiences as a child more than 60 years ago. Well, that's nice. That's good.
I was going to say the one above it says, do you have lay members that teach adult children and youth Sunday school or classes?
Sure.
You have multiple paid clergy that does that. Can you, and maybe that's in part of that answer, how do you involve members of your congregation, of your group, in sharing the responsibility, teaching, sharing, things like that with other members?
I mean, so fluidly. Like, we have, a rabbi or a priest in relationship to the congregation, in large part because usually there's so many more numbers of lay people to a priest. Well, priests are in short supply now, so that's particularly true. But, we're part of that Protestant tradition that would have a much lower hierarchy. So, I mean, I can be in a meeting and completely have my ideas dismissed and laughed at, just like, just as easily, and I could say as foolish. So there really isn't very little hierarchy there. And lay people I don't even get a vote at the church board meetings, for example. Like, everyone else is placed a little bit higher in the hierarchy than the minister is, who's sort of a leader servant, right? I don't have a vote. So I'm essentially powerless, but with the whatever kind of impact I have in terms of my role or my voice or my character or whatever. So I have no formal power as the minister of any UU church, which is really comforting, actually. I like that. You sort of earn the respect or the lack of respect that any one group that you serve has for you. And all my churches have, and this one included, has both respected and disrespected me in probably the most appropriate of ways. That's where that is.
Great, thanks. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? These are great questions. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, they're good questions. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I think the most important question I would ask is where we're going to be in 25 years. And a couple opportunities exist and a couple challenges, right? I mean, we have the flexibility to draw people in that other churches don't, or we call ourselves churches mostly, but sometimes they're called fellowships because church is a loaded word for folks and they don't accurately describe us always. And we could also end up losing because we need to replace the present generation. If we don't replace the generation of recent retirees to the people who are going to pass away, we're going to lose our churches. And yet at the same time, we also have the opportunity to have more people coming in from underneath. So we're very much similar to many Protestant churches that are threatened. And we're also doing slightly better than most of them because we've got more come-inners. You know, Lutheranism, for example, has historically been reliant upon immigrants from like Germanic Scandinavian countries. We don't have any kind of ethnic connection, and we have not lost that sort of natural input. Catholics have sustained themselves in part because there's a lot of immigrants from Catholic countries. Almost everyone who's a UU, about 85% are people who come out from other traditions. So we're constantly sort of scrambling to get the people who've never been churched or the people who've formerly been churched and now want churches for their kids or because it's a home for where they now spiritually and ethically live.
So that begs a question for me in relation to that. Are there efforts that you have or your community has to, I'll just say proselyte, maybe proselyte is a loaded term, but to share, to encourage folks in your community to share with others the positive experiences that they have and how it may be valuable to them? We in our church, we do that a lot. I mean, sometimes we're pretty heavy-handed, one might say, but I know that a big focus for those of us are young people that will serve an actual proselyting mission where it's sort of like their full-time focus. A big part of that is really, and I think most effectively, when they're just sharing how following these principles, living this life this way has blessed them, has been a practical benefit to them. And so my question, Steve, is, is there any emphasis in your efforts with your community to encourage folks to share, to invite, to give folks the opportunity to come and experience the positive things that they're experiencing?
We struggle with that. I think every single UU thinks every other UU should do more of that. And I think that's really captures it, right? It's sort of that proselytizing evangelical streak is exactly what drove us to Unitarian Universalism. And it is exactly what's keeping us from thriving. So we stand right where there might be some uncomfortability within the Mormon tradition that people have to go on their 2-year missions and, these kind of standard practices. I'm jealous that that's not a part of our traditions, right? We struggle with that. Even like bring a friend to church Sunday. I mean, we do that. We have a whole bunch of techniques. I'm always pitching people to try to, share your story. Our largest sort of latest group of people for whom it was life-saving have been people in the LGBT community. We were very seriously pro-marriage equality. And for them, for a lot of people who've come from no tradition or, more heavy-handed traditions, we can be a life-saving place where they can take a breath and be themselves. That's the sort of most likely evangelical quality that we have, because you can always walk out of a UU church, walk out into secular society and not feel like there's that much difference there. That's sort of where our greatest loss of sales margin would come from, right? There's not a lot of social stigma for not going to the UU church that you grew up in or even continuing to be one. People say, oh, you guys are a cult. And I sort of go, no way, we're not nearly that effective at recruitment.
Folks in my church are familiar with that sometimes accusation as well. So
sure.
I wanted to share that there are a lot of challenges, even if you do have folks who, I'll say, feel pressure to have that kind of commitment to serve and proselyte. And that's one of the challenges that we have in a number of areas in our church is, young people that will go and then they won't stay out very long because it's really not, it's really not suited to them, or maybe their heart's not into it.
Yeah.
And even I talked to a friend and he's got 6 kids, and one of them, 2 of them have served a mission, and one of them, he talked it over with the dad and said, that's just not for me, And so it's my friend, as a father, obviously, and he's a good father, and he has a lot of, I consider good ethic values. So he's talked it over with him, and he's made it clear that, yeah, I support you, and there's other ways you can share. It doesn't have to be that sort of direct, full-time experience and stuff. So just so you can appreciate that, there's 2 sides of it. There are challenges, and it's important to, as part of the challenge is to not allow there to be a stigma associated with that, because that can drive people away. And again, it all comes back to whatever. One of the things that's great about Religion 101, right, is that we can all have a great appreciation about how much better the lives of people in our community can be when they're participating in, when they're putting some emphasis in their life on spiritual, religious, ethical focus.
Yep.
And I think it's fair to say most everyone would agree, our society in whole can only benefit from that, in as much as it supports, sort of fair, sort of being fair, right? And treating others with love and respect. That's all what it really comes down to. So thanks for sharing that as well. Appreciate that.
Carol had a few questions there that I don't want to miss, and I couldn't
go ahead.
read them all. Does she just want to voice them? I mean, Carol, I see that you've noted a few things.
Sure, I can do that.
Yeah.
You didn't really answer my question on whether or not you have lay people that teach any of your, I don't know if you have like a Sunday school. Do you just have a worship service, and who teaches the different classes?
We have had a person who plays the DRE. So in our church, which is relatively small size, that person teaches as well as coordinates curriculum and gives teachers some guidance. Mostly it's parents, so it's not terribly interestingly different than most churches that are required on volunteers, because for that precious hour of Sunday school, or we call it RE. So yes, we don't have enough resources to have professionals if we wanted to. So, and it's not really part of our culture to really need that kind of hierarchy to teach the kids. So, I mean, we have lay people preaching sermons. I generally bring in what we call a worship associate. There's some vetting to that, but I'm really try to be as inclusive as possible to give everybody who wants a chance to come and do a reading or a prayer, or there's a very horizontal sense of power in the UU Church across the board. And I think it's best expressed by the fact that I'm the one person in the 160 of us that doesn't get a vote. Sure.
Okay. And then my other question was, just with my interaction with people in general, sometimes it's easy to talk about being inclusive, but when it comes down to it, people still separate into their own little groups. Is that, with your overarching philosophy, is that less of a problem in your congregation?
Well, the homogeneity of our group, right, which we sort of bemoan, also makes a lot of that easier. Of course, people have their friends, and we'll want to sit with them. We have a lunch after church, so there isn't a whole lot of demographic differences in which you could see walk into a classroom at lunch at an elementary school, and the Asian kids are sitting together and the soccer players are sitting together and the whatever. We don't tend to have that. We would probably try to, I think we're pretty welcoming to people who are new. So that question, I don't know how to answer that. I think the general answer to that is no. I mean, we don't have that because there aren't vast differences among us other than maybe generationally. I mean, that would be on the patio or at church on a Sunday following services, the greatest diversity we would have are between kids, the parents that have kids, and different generations of people from there on up. And they tend to gravitate towards one another because they've known each other for forever. And, you go to church to see your friends to some degree. So that's a bit of a challenge, but not really. I mean, we're pretty friendly. And, the harder part, I think, is building the systems that keep people engaged, that are personal enough to touch them and aren't creepy and stalking in the way to keep them, right? Like, that's a hard balance to strike because everyone's different in terms of how much they want to be courted or even greeted. Like, when I go to a UU church, the last thing I want them to know, I don't have many Sundays off, but the last thing I ever want to know is that I'm a minister, because, then they got to announce you and say you're here, and, I might want to sneak out mid-service. So, it's, it varies. Good question, though.
Hey,
Thank
Donald, did you have a question? I saw you were off mute.
Is there a question or no? I didn't see.
Donald, did you have a question?
Did you say Donald?
Yeah.
Yes, I've noticed in my work with Interfaith Councils, we have 10 in Orange County, that the UU people seem to be more represented, disproportionately represented. How do you feel about interfaith work? And do you do much in Los Angeles County?
Well, I'm on the South Coast Interfaith Council board. I hadn't done, I'm in my 4th year, so I hadn't really done that much. And I can honestly say that I have very cool relationships with people up on the Hill. I think that's, I mean, the answer is UUs generally do a lot of this because we are the sort of, I mean, we are the interfaith church in a weird way. But we might be the no faith church, but we're the interfaith church. And so that's very, amenable to us. We're very not exclusive. I think for me, the size of the church makes that, I have enough to do that's stretching out to do that. If we had like another staff, that might be a little bit easier. I'm sort of at that edge of not being able to manage too much of that, just in terms of time. But it's not for lack of will, I mean, I've been involved, and then the UU ministers, of course, meet. So that's a little bit of a time commitment. We have our commitment to our own colleagues and our own, groups of UUs that are ground. I meet probably about every 3rd month, if you want to be really honest about it. But I'm part of a group in Orange County, call ourselves the Honey Badgers. And there's like the 6 churches that are around Anaheim and Costa Mesa and Long Beach. And we're the furthest north of that. I could have connected with a group of 10 churches in LA, but they were a little further and I just sort of picked one. So, I joined South Coast Interfaith to be more ecumenical and to do things just exactly like this and outreach and to figure out what other people are doing. So, I've done the car-a-thon with the food drive with you guys. And, the answer is yes, when possible.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to always be you. It could be members.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, we would be better at this if I was a better instinctive collaborator. I tend to things to fall into my hole and I either do them or I don't. That's sort of an area of professional growth for me, is getting things out of my email box and into the hands of somebody who might do something with it is a thing I actually really need to work on. Because, and the pandemic's thrown that off too. Like, I've just sort of kept holding my breath, hoping we get back together. And then Sundays became a time where we'd almost always have an after church meeting of some social justice commitment or some practical church meeting, or, we were together enough to do that stuff organically. I think
No.
we as a church have done a better job than I've done at managing that. But, our committees have a little bit fallen into a place that they already were not great at. And we need to build them up when the fall comes. Kind of my philosophy.
Steve, one of the things that you should be aware of, and I'll send you an email and copy Joan Berens. She helps organize a group of clergy that meet in Palos Verdes,
Oh, yeah.
I think like once a month or something like that. And they were meeting in person for lunch,
Yep.
and I think they have been meeting virtually.
Is it
And
Dawn
that might-
Unity Dawn?
No. That is another. Those are the Dawn Interfaith Unity Group has a series of seminars, sort of like quarterly. But
Right.
this is a group of pretty much clergy, and Joan is sort of one of the organizers of it. And
Sounds great.
I'll connect you to her, because I think that would be a great benefit, because she pretty much knows all the clergy that are there in Palos Verdes and Rolling Hills, like on the hill and stuff. And
Yeah.
that might give you a great opportunity to meet other, and it is particularly for clergy. And I'm not sure exactly how it's meeting right now, but I believe it is. So I'll send you an email and connect you to that, because it's some of the times it's just that you aren't aware of. You don't have it takes something like this, right, to get a connection to say, oh yeah, I would be grateful to participate. So
Exactly.
I'll follow up with you on that.
Awesome. Thanks, James.
Yeah, Donald, you got another question, please?
Well, yeah, just a comment on that. I formed a group of 7 faith groups close to my congregation, like within a few miles of each other.
Mhm.
And that's working out very, very, very well. We communicate what we're doing with COVID, and how we're handling disaster preparedness, and how we're, resources for helping the needy. And it's nice to have a geographically proximate, close by.
Yeah, it helps. Yeah.
Faith groups. I hope you can do that where you are. But is anybody else doing that? I think it's a good concept. Seems to be working very well for us. But anybody else on the call have that experience with that? Getting small groups of geographically proximate. It's short of being an interfaith council. Anyway, this is thought I'd pass on. And the question I have is, I was looking at your website, and it has the principles and the sort of thing on it. What is the single best general website if someone wants to learn more about you?
UUA.org.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Donald. Good questions. Good point.
And I have a personal question for you a little later.
By the way,
Well,
you look like
I'm very impressed with the slides you prepared. I mean, they're very good. Excellent job.
there's probably some grammar problems in there, but okay, they're not bad.
And I happened to capture the screenshots of those.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you feel about my sharing some of those with people along with the link.
Sure. I sent them to James, and I gave him full permission to share them anywhere. If you put your email in the chat, I'm sure Kelly has them. She can send them to you right now. Anybody can have them.
Yeah, for sure. What I will do is, when I pull up this seminar and we post it on the YouTube channel, I'll have a link in the description that'll go to like a Google Drive with these charts. I've done that before, because we frequently have speakers that have like additional materials to share and things like that. So for sure.
That would be terrific. If someone missed this, maybe they can catch up that way. And
Yeah.
and the slides are part of it, a big part of it. So thank you, Really Late.
Oh, thanks. I mean, happy to help. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
I had one last question, and so the emphasis that you have on I know I'm probably understating it, but at least one of the emphasis on ethical choices and this idea that you have this goal, I'll say objective, of the folks in your community and yourself to grow and develop in a way to make good choices, ethical choices, choices that are let's say selfless in a way, sort of taking good consideration for others, as well as being rational in how to sort of like sort of, let's say, live and make a contribution in life. The are there other groups or organizations that you're familiar with that sort of share that with even a more secular, perhaps
Right.
even a more secular focus? I saw a seminar, I watched a seminar, it was sort of like a fireside chat with a person who was had I think it's the objectivist, it's a objectivism, and the emphasis is not on theology. They're basically adopt a atheistic point of view, but
Yep.
there's a very, very strong focus on morality and ethical choices and how they encourage folks to deal with others in all the aspects of their life. And so I was just interested, maybe even not with that specific example, but have you found other sort of groups or institutions that sort of share that you have some affinity to, even just regardless of what they are on the spectrum of sort of I'll say theological devoutness, for lack of a better word?
Yes. Well, there's humanism, right? Which is, you can, Google humanism, and humanism, the people who started the humanist tradition, particularly the religious version of the humanist tradition, half of them were Unitarian Universalist ministers who signed the Humanist Manifesto back in 1933, I believe it is. Ethical Culture is an organization that's sort of similar to us. They would be us without the sort of religious flavor. I would say our greatest kin are with like a lot, Reformed Judaism has a lot of commonalities with us. We are a lot like, the name particularly brings us together, but we're a little bit like the Unity Church, but we're a little bit less, and I don't mean this to be insulting, we're a little bit less woo-woo than they are, and they're a little bit more spiritual than we are. So we try to walk that line. I think that's exactly the line we try to walk. We try to be spiritual without being definitively theological in any one way that would be off-putting or definitively make anybody feel uncomfortable, which is, a hard line to walk. Spirituality, our greatest, hold on. God's trying to tell us something. We try to walk that line, and it's a challenge because spirituality for you is hard, because spirituality is a hard thing to get your hands on anyway, of course, right? So when you've got like Lectio Divina or a rosary or a particular set of paths or a program to walk through, it can deepen you just because it can eliminate the noise. You struggle to eliminate the what other options are there noise, because we're so open, right? The joke that I wanted to tell, which is very telling, is what do you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness with a Unitarian Universalist? And the answer is someone who comes knocking at your door but isn't really quite sure why. And you could put Mormon in there too, of course, but and that's really where it gets sort of clumsy and comical on our end. Is another great joke is like, how many UUs does it take to screw in a light bulb? And, the response is, we want to make no definitive comments on what kind of appropriate light is acceptable for you. We acknowledge and admonish fluorescent lights and incandescent lights and LED lights, whatever so that openness can be a burden. And that is where we're at our most comical and weakest. And that, the other side of that is, of course, the strength. Life is a series of polarities. What you don't get when you have a group that's adhered to one another and is an Amish group that doesn't date outside of its own class and build its own barns and doesn't have a cell phone. What you lose with that is the broadening of the opportunities of the world, and what you gain with that is a kind of inclusivity and communal spirit that takes you out of your own individuality. So UUs are about the most secular religious form of religion there is, with all the challenges and all the blessings that comes with.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thanks everyone for participating, and really thank you to Reverend Steve Wilson
And Kelly.
And Kelly, who provided such great support and collaboration and assistance. So really appreciate that. What a great, this is probably going to be the slickest looking video for Religion 101 posted. So I've actually got some tips and pointers that I can use for the ones coming up. Before we turn it back to Reverend Wilson for any parting thoughts, I did want to share a couple of things. First, our next Religion 101 will be in March on the fourth Thursday, which is March 25th. And let's see if I can just share this with everyone. This will be on the Episcopal Church. Reverend Father Michael Fincher from St. Gregory's Episcopal Church in Long Beach will be our speaker. So we're really looking forward to that. And we are working to plan additional seminars starting in April. We do have Reverend Jonathan Shute from Rolling Hills United Methodist Church will be our speaker. I don't have a flyer for that yet, but that's going to be forthcoming. And we've also got some other speakers throughout the rest of the year that we're working to nail down a schedule, but have a commitment is David Brown from Wayfarers Chapel to talk about the Swedenborgian Church, and Elaine Larson to talk about the United Church of Christ and I think it's the Long Beach Congregational Church. So those will be great speakers as well, and we'll just continue to add to the richness that we get from such wonderful programs like the one that we've had tonight. So if you are another quick plug is the South Coast Interfaith Council is holding our annual assembly this March. And if you're interested in participating in providing a sponsorship, there's information on all of that on the SCIC website, which is
SCInterfaith.org.
Thank you, Carol. SCInterfaith.org. And I always put a link on our YouTube post, and I will send out an email to our distribution group when we do have this seminar posted on the SCIC YouTube channel, and it'll give you a chance to look at it, to check that out. So if you do are willing or want to participate or want to provide an ad or a video segment as part of a sponsorship, then for you or your community, then that's where to go to take care of that. And if there are folks that you know of that you think would be a great speaker for the Religion 101 series, especially organization, a community that we haven't heard from, then please feel free to email me and give me the name and email information. I'd love to contact them. I reach out to a lot of folks. Not everyone gets back to me right away, and some don't get back to me ever, but it really is important for us to try to be inclusive and really hear from, just like I said, the rich diversity of religions, faiths, and faith traditions and communities that we have in the South Bay and in Long Beach. So thank you very much. So I'll turn it back to you, Steve, if you just want to share anything in closing, and then we'll wish everyone a great night.
I guess I invite us to close our eyes and imagine a world where everyone's faith was respected and we all came to terms with the truth that at best we're seeing through a veil, and that there's no greater wisdom than compassion, as the Dalai Lama says. And I'll close with that. Amen. Thanks.
Amen. Thanks.
for being
Thanks,
great
everyone.
people.
Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you.
Great.
Oh, good. Thanks.